The dust danced like specters in the late afternoon sun, as Faith O'Sullivan stood at her husband's grave for the fourth time this week, her calloused fingers clutching a bouquet of wildflowers that were beginning to wilt in the unforgiving Texas heat. 3 years had passed since that fateful day when Thomas had ridden out to confront cattle rustlers and returned home draped over his saddle. 3 years, and Whispering Creek still whispered that she should move on, but Faith's heart remained buried 6 feet under alongside her husband's wedding band. The year was 1878, and the town of Whispering Creek, Texas, had seen its fair share of tragedy and triumph. The railroad had finally reached them last year, bringing with it new faces, new opportunities, and new troubles. Faith's small ranch on the outskirts of town had once thrived under Thomas's capable hands, but now she struggled to keep it afloat, relying on the occasional help of neighboring ranchers and her own stubborn determination. "Thomas," she whispered, kneeling to place the flowers against his headstone. "The cattle are doing well this season. I managed to hire 2 hands for the roundup next month." She paused, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. At 28, Faith was still young, though grief had etched fine lines around her blue eyes. "Everyone says I should sell the ranch, that a woman has no business running land this size alone." The grave offered no response, just as it hadn't for the last 3 years. Faith sighed, her fingers tracing the etched letters of her husband's name. "I miss you," she said simply before rising to her feet, brushing the dirt from her skirt. As she turned to leave, she noticed a rider approaching in the distance, his form silhouetted against the setting sun. Faith squinted, trying to make out the figure. It wasn't anyone from town, she was certain. The way he sat his horse, tall and straight-backed, was unfamiliar. Faith waited, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun, the other instinctively reaching for the small revolver she kept in her pocket. Thomas had taught her to shoot years ago, insisting that a woman alone on the frontier needed to protect herself. It was one of the many skills she'd had to perfect since his passing. The rider drew closer, and Faith could make out more details now. He rode a handsome chestnut gelding, his clothes dusty from the trail. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his hat, but she could see a strong jawline and the dark shadow of several days' worth of beard. "Madam," he called, tipping his hat as he reined his horse to a stop a respectful distance away. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." "This is private property," Faith responded, her hand still near her pocket. "The town's another mile east." The stranger dismounted with an easy grace, his boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. As he removed his hat, Faith saw that his hair was the color of mahogany, touched with strands of gold from the sun. His eyes, a striking shade of green, met hers with a directness that was both disarming and slightly unsettling. "Name's Colton Vance," he said, extending a hand that was rough and calloused. "I'm looking for work. Heard in town you might be hiring for the season." Faith hesitated before accepting his handshake. His grip was firm but not overpowering, and there was something in his gaze that spoke of honesty. Still, she had learned to be cautious. "Who told you that?" she asked, studying him carefully. "Fella at the general store, older man with a gray beard, said you run the 00 ranch and might need an extra hand for the roundup." "That would be Mr. Garrison," Faith said, relaxing slightly. Henry Garrison had been a friend of Thomas's and had looked out for her since his passing. If he'd sent this man her way, there might be something to him. "I've already hired 2 men for the roundup." Colton Vance nodded, replacing his hat. "Fair enough. Don't mean to bother you especially." His eyes drifted to the grave behind her, and a look of understanding crossed his features. "I apologize for the intrusion, Mrs. O'Sullivan," Faith supplied. "Faith O'Sullivan. Mrs. O'Sullivan," he repeated, the name seeming to settle on his tongue like he was committing it to memory. "I'll be on my way, then." As he turned to remount his horse, Faith found herself hesitating. There was something about the man that seemed trustworthy, and the truth was, she could use more than just 2 hands for the roundup. The Double O had nearly 500 head of cattle scattered across 2,000 acres. 2 men wouldn't be enough, not really. "Wait," she called, surprising herself as much as him. "How much experience do you have with cattle?" Colton turned back, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Been working cattle since I was old enough to sit a horse, madam. Drove herds up to Kansas 3 times. Worked ranches in Colorado, New Mexico, and all over Texas." Faith considered him for a moment longer. "I can't pay much," she warned. "Not until after the cattle are sold. I'm not looking for riches, Mrs. O'Sullivan, just honest work and a place to lay my head." Faith nodded slowly. "There's a bunkhouse by the main house. You can stay there with the other hands when they arrive next week. For now, it's just you and me and my foreman, Eduardo." Colton's smile widened, revealing straight white teeth against his tanned skin. "I appreciate the opportunity, madam. I won't let you down." As they rode back to the ranch together, Faith couldn't help but steal glances at her new hire. There was something different about him, something she couldn't quite place. Most drifting cowboys were rough around the edges, hardened by years on the trail and too much whiskey. Colton Vance carried himself with a quiet dignity, and when he spoke, his words were thoughtful and articulate. The Double O Ranch came into view as they crested a small rise. The main house was modest but well built, a 2-story structure with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Nearby stood the bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings that comprised the heart of the operation. Beyond stretched the pastures where Faith's cattle grazed, the land rolling gently toward the horizon. "Beautiful place," Colton remarked, genuine admiration in his voice. "You've kept it up well." "It was my husband's pride and joy," Faith said, a familiar pang of loss squeezing her heart. "I do my best to honor his memory by keeping it going." "How long has he been gone?" Colton asked, his tone respectful rather than prying. 3 years this past April," Faith replied, surprised by her willingness to share such personal information with a stranger. "Cattle rustlers." Colton's expression darkened. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Losing someone you love is never easy." There was something in the way he said it that made Faith wonder if he spoke from experience. Before she could inquire further, they arrived at the barn, where a middle-aged Mexican man was brushing down a horse. "Eduardo," Faith called, dismounting. "This is Mr. Vance. He'll be joining us for the roundup." Eduardo nodded in greeting, his weathered face impassive as he sized up the newcomer. "Buenas tardes, senor." "Buenas tardes," Colton replied with a surprisingly good accent. "Es un placer conocerte." Eduardo's eyebrows rose slightly, and he responded with a stream of Spanish that was too quick for Faith to follow. Colton answered in kind, and soon the 2 men were conversing easily while unsaddling their horses. Faith watched, impressed. "You speak Spanish," she observed when there was a lull in the conversation. Colton shrugged modestly. "Worked alongside many Mexican vaqueros over the years. Best cowboys I've ever known. Seemed only right to learn their language." Eduardo, who was normally reserved with strangers, appeared to approve of this answer. He clapped Colton on the shoulder before excusing himself to finish his chores. "I'll show you to the bunkhouse," Faith said, leading the way across the yard. "It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and dry." "That's all any man can ask for," Colton assured her. The bunkhouse was a long, low building with bunks for 8 men. It had been Thomas's pride to employ a full crew during busy seasons, though Faith had been forced to scale back since his death. A pot-bellied stove stood in the center of the room for heating, and a rough-hewn table with benches occupied one end. "You can take your pick of bunks since you're the first to arrive," Faith told him. "There's a well behind the house for water, and meals are served in the main house. Breakfast at sunrise, supper at sunset." "Yes, madam," Colton said, setting his saddlebags on a nearby bunk. "If you don't mind my asking, what are your immediate needs around the place? I'd like to make myself useful right away." Faith hesitated, unaccustomed to such eagerness. "Most hired hands did what was required and no more. The north fence line needs mending," she said finally. "We've had coyotes getting at the calves." "I'll start there first thing tomorrow," Colton promised. "Anything else? The windmill's been making a strange noise when it turns." "Eduardo thinks it might be a loose bolt somewhere, but he hasn't had time to climb up and check." "Consider it done," Colton said with a nod. "I've fixed my share of windmills." Faith found herself smiling, the expression feeling strangely unfamiliar on her face. "Well, Mr. Vance, it seems I made the right decision hiring you." "I hope you'll still feel that way after I've been here a while," he replied with a grin. "And please call me Colton. Mr. Vance was my father." "Colton, then," Faith agreed, though she knew it was improper for a widow to address an unmarried man by his first name. But out here, miles from town and the judgmental eyes of society, such proprieties seemed less important. "Supper will be ready in about an hour. You're welcome to wash up at the pump before then." As she walked back to the main house, Faith couldn't help but feel a strange sense of anticipation. It had been a long time since she'd felt anything but grief and determination. The arrival of Colton Vance had somehow shifted the air around her, like the first cool breeze after a long, hot summer. In the kitchen, Faith busied herself preparing supper, adding an extra potato to the stew she'd started earlier. As she worked, she found herself wondering about her new hire. He wasn't like the other cowboys who had passed through over the years. There was a gentleness to him that belied his obvious strength, an intelligence in his eyes that spoke of a man who thought before he acted. Through the window, she could see him at the pump, shirt off as he sluiced water over his head and torso. Faith quickly looked away, a blush heating her cheeks. It had been a long time since she'd allowed herself to notice a man in that way. Thomas had been gone for 3 years, but in her heart, she still considered herself a married woman. By the time supper was ready, Faith had regained her composure. She called to Eduardo, who lived in a small cabin behind the barn, and he joined them at the table. Colton arrived moments later, his hair still damp from washing, wearing a clean shirt. "Smells wonderful, Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said appreciatively as Faith ladled stew into his bowl. "It's nothing special," she demurred. "Just a simple beef stew." "After weeks of my own cooking on the trail, this is a feast," Colton assured her, breaking a piece of cornbread. "Thank you." The meal passed pleasantly, with Eduardo and Colton exchanging stories of ranches they had worked and cattle drives they'd survived. Faith mostly listened, offering the occasional comment or question. It struck her how long it had been since the kitchen had been filled with conversation and laughter. Since Thomas's death, meals with Eduardo had been quiet, functional affairs. After supper, Colton insisted on helping with the dishes despite Faith's protests. "My mother raised me to believe that the person who doesn't cook should clean," he explained, rolling up his sleeves. "Besides, you've been working all day. You deserve a rest." Faith reluctantly agreed, settling into a chair with a cup of coffee while Colton washed and Eduardo dried. Watching them work together, already comfortable in each other's company, Faith felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. Later, as she prepared for bed, Faith found herself standing at her bedroom window, gazing out at the bunkhouse where a single lamp still glowed. What kind of man was Colton Vance, really? And why did his presence make her feel both unsettled and more at peace than she had in years? Faith turned from the window with a shake of her head. It didn't matter. He was a hired hand, nothing more. In a few months after the roundup and cattle sale, he would move on like all the others, and her life would return to its familiar rhythm of work and solitude. Still, as she slipped beneath the quilt, Faith couldn't quite banish the image of green eyes and a smile that seemed to promise something she'd thought forever lost. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Faith, Eduardo, and Colton prepared for the roundup. True to his word, Colton proved to be an invaluable addition to the ranch. He mended the north fence line in 2 days, fixed the windmill, repaired the leaky roof on the barn, and still found time to help Eduardo move a small herd from the south pasture to fresher grazing land near the creek. Faith found herself increasingly impressed by his work ethic and skills. More than once, she caught herself watching him as he worked, admiring the fluid way he moved, the confidence with which he handled even the most difficult tasks. It had been so long since she'd had someone truly capable helping around the ranch, someone she didn't have to constantly direct or correct. One evening, about 2 weeks after Colton's arrival, Faith was reviewing her ledgers at the kitchen table when a knock came at the door. She opened it to find Colton standing on the porch, hat in hand. "Evening, Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Faith assured him, stepping back to allow him inside. "Is something wrong?" "No, madam. I was just wondering if you had a moment to discuss the plans for the roundup. The other hands will be arriving soon, and I'd like to be clear on your expectations." Faith gestured to the table. "Please, sit down. Would you like some coffee?" "That would be nice, thank you." As Faith busied herself at the stove, Colton glanced at the open ledger on the table. His brow furrowed slightly, but he quickly looked away when Faith returned with 2 cups of coffee. "I was thinking," Colton began after taking a sip, "that we might want to start the roundup from the northwest corner of your property. There's good water there for the cattle, and it would allow us to work our way south and east, gathering as we go." Faith nodded. "That's how Thomas always did it," she agreed. "It's the most efficient route." Colton hesitated, then said carefully, "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I couldn't help noticing your ledger. If you don't mind my saying so, it seems like you're running pretty close to the edge financially." Faith stiffened, her pride bristling at the observation even as she recognized its truth. "The ranch has had some difficult years," she admitted reluctantly. "But this year's sale should put us back on solid ground." Colton nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "I've been thinking about your cattle. You have a good herd, strong stock, but they could fetch a higher price with a bit of strategic breeding. Have you considered introducing some Hereford blood? They're gaining popularity up north, and a crossbreed would give you hardier calves that put on weight faster." Faith blinked, surprised by the suggestion. Thomas had always been conservative in his breeding practices, sticking with what he knew worked. "I've heard of Herefords, but I've never seen any up close. There's a rancher over in Amarillo who's been having good luck with them," Colton said. "After the roundup, it might be worth riding over there to take a look. If you like what you see, maybe you could trade a few of your cows for one of his bulls." The idea was intriguing, and Faith found herself nodding. "I'll consider it," she said. "Thank you for the suggestion." Colton smiled, that warm, genuine smile that seemed to light up his entire face. "Just trying to earn my keep, madam." They spent the next hour discussing the roundup in detail, with Colton offering observations and suggestions that revealed his deep knowledge of cattle and ranching. By the time he left, Faith had a clearer picture of the work ahead and a growing respect for her new hand's expertise. As she readied for bed that night, Faith found herself thinking about Colton's suggestion regarding the Herefords. It was the kind of forward-thinking idea that Thomas would have appreciated. He had always been open to innovation, even when other ranchers in the area clung stubbornly to tradition. For the first time in 3 years, Faith fell asleep thinking about the future of the ranch rather than its past. The remaining hands arrived the following week, bringing with them the energy and chaos that always preceded a roundup. Faith had managed to hire 5 men in total, all experienced cowboys who had worked the 00 in previous years. They greeted Eduardo like an old friend and eyed Colton, with the cautious respect cowboys reserved for newcomers who had yet to prove themselves. Faith observed the dynamics with interest as she served breakfast on the first morning. Colton sat quietly at the end of the table, listening more than speaking as the others swapped stories and jokes. When he did speak, it was with a measured thoughtfulness that gradually drew the others into more serious conversation about the work ahead. By the end of breakfast, it was clear that Colton had earned a measure of respect from the crew. Faith wasn't surprised. There was something about him that inspired confidence, a quiet competence that spoke louder than boasts or bravado. The roundup began at dawn the next day, with the men splitting into pairs to cover different sections of the ranch. Faith, who had always participated alongside the men during Thomas's time, found herself paired with Colton. "Hope you don't mind riding with me," he said as they saddled their horses in the pre-dawn light. "Eduardo thought it might be best, since I'm still learning the layout of your land." Faith suspected there was more to Eduardo's decision than Colton was letting on. The foreman had been watching her interactions with the new hand with knowing eyes. Still, she couldn't find it in herself to object to the arrangement. "I don't mind," she assured him, checking the cinch on her saddle. "You'll find I can pull my weight on a roundup." Colton's smile flashed in the lantern light. "I never doubted it for a moment, Mrs. O'Sullivan." As they rode out into the gray morning, Faith felt a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with the roundup. It had been a long time since she'd spent a day in the company of someone who seemed to see her as more than just a widow struggling to maintain her husband's legacy. The work was hard, as it always was. They rode for miles, pushing cattle from thickets and gullies, gradually herding them toward the central gathering point. The sun beat down mercilessly as the day progressed, and dust coated their skin and clothing until they were nearly the same color as the parched earth beneath their horses' hooves. Through it all, Faith was keenly aware of Colton's presence. He rode with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, handling his horse and the cattle with equal skill. When a young steer broke from the herd, Colton was after it in an instant, turning it back with a series of quick maneuvers that spoke of years of experience. During a brief rest at midday as they watered their horses at a small stream, Colton passed Faith his canteen. "You're every bit as good as any man I've worked with," he said admiringly. "Better than most, truth be told." Faith took a drink, grateful for the cool water. "Thomas insisted I learn every aspect of ranching," she explained, passing the canteen back. "He said a woman should never be dependent on a man for her survival." "Sounds like a wise man," Colton observed, his eyes studying her face. "You must miss him a great deal." "Every day," Faith admitted, surprising herself with her candor. "Some days more than others." Colton nodded, his gaze drifting to the distant horizon. "I lost someone once," he said quietly. "Not a wife, but someone I cared for deeply. It changes you, that kind of loss." Faith looked at him curiously, wondering about the story behind his words, but Colton had already turned his attention back to their horses. The moment for confidences had passed. By sunset, they had gathered nearly 100 head, driving them to join the cattle the other men had rounded up. As they made camp that night, the talk around the fire was of the day's work and the work still to come. Faith, exhausted but satisfied, listened to the familiar rhythm of cowboy conversation, the boasts and jokes and stories that never seemed to change. Colton sat across the fire from her, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. Occasionally, his eyes would meet hers, and Faith would feel a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a dangerous feeling, one she wasn't ready to acknowledge, let alone act upon. The roundup continued for nearly 2 weeks, with each day following the same pattern. Rise before dawn, work until dusk, collapse into exhausted sleep, only to do it all again the next day. Faith and Colton fell into a comfortable rhythm, working together with an efficiency that spoke of natural compatibility. By the end of the second week, they had gathered nearly all of the double-O cattle. The herd, nearly 500 strong, grazed in the holding pasture near the ranch house, awaiting the arrival of the buyers who would drive them to the railhead in San Antonio. On the final night of the roundup, with only a few stragglers left to gather, Faith decided to thank her crew with a proper feast. She spent the afternoon cooking while the men finished the last of the work, preparing a meal of roast beef, potatoes, beans, and apple pie that would have made her mother proud. The cowboys arrived back at the ranch just as the sun was setting, dirty and tired but in high spirits. They washed up at the pump before filing into the house, their appreciative exclamations at the sight of the laden table bringing a smile to Faith's face. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, you've outdone yourself," declared Bill Jenkins, the oldest of the hands, as he surveyed the feast. "I ain't seen a spread like this since last Christmas at my sister's place." "You've all worked hard," Faith said, gesturing for them to be seated. "Consider it my way of saying thank you." The meal was a raucous affair, with the men eating as if they hadn't seen food in days, talking and laughing between mouthfuls. Faith, seated at the head of the table as was proper for the ranch owner, found her gaze repeatedly drawn to Colton, who sat near the middle, participating in the conversation but still maintaining that air of thoughtful reserve that set him apart. After the meal, as the men moved to the porch with their coffee and tobacco, Faith began clearing the table. To her surprise, Colton stayed behind to help. "You should join the others," Faith told him as he gathered plates. "You've earned your rest." "So have you," Colton replied, carrying the dishes to the wash basin. "Besides, I meant what I said about not cooking and cleaning. It's only fair I help." Faith didn't argue further, secretly grateful for the assistance. As they worked side by side, washing and drying the dishes, a comfortable silence settled between them. "Tomorrow the buyers will come," Faith said finally, handing Colton a plate to dry. "If all goes well, we should get a good price for the cattle." Colton nodded, carefully drying the plate before setting it on the shelf. "Your herd looks good, strong and healthy. You should be proud of what you've accomplished here, Mrs. O'Sullivan." "Faith," she said impulsively, then flushed at her boldness. "You can call me Faith." After working together these past weeks, Mrs. O'Sullivan seems overly formal. Colton's eyes met hers, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Faith," he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name. "It suits you." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something Faith wasn't ready to name. She looked away, focusing intently on scrubbing a particularly stubborn pot. "Will you be moving on after the sale?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Most cowboys did, following the work from ranch to ranch. That depends, Colton said, his voice soft. Would you like me to stay? Faith's hands stilled in the soapy water. The question seemed to hang in the air between them, weighted with meaning beyond the simple words. The ranch always needs good hands, she said finally, not quite answering his question. Colton seemed to understand what she wasn't saying. He nodded, accepting her evasion without pressing further. Then I'll stay, at least for a while. Relief and something like anticipation fluttered in Faith's chest. I'd like that, she admitted, allowing herself to meet his gaze once more. The moment was broken by the sound of laughter from the porch, reminding them that they weren't alone. Faith quickly returned to washing the dishes, and Colton resumed drying. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities neither was ready to pursue, but both were aware existed. The cattle buyers arrived the next morning, two well-dressed men from a company in Chicago who examined the herd with critical eyes before offering a price. Faith, who had done her research and knew what cattle were fetching at the railhead, countered with a figure of her own. The negotiations took most of the morning, with Faith holding firm despite the buyers' attempts to lower the price. Colton stood nearby, saying nothing but lending his silent support as Faith refused to be intimidated. "Very well, Mrs. O'Sullivan," the lead buyer finally conceded. "We have a deal. We'll take the entire herd at your price." Faith managed to maintain her composure as they shook hands, but inside she was elated. The sale price was higher than she had dared hope, enough to pay off the ranch's debts and leave a comfortable cushion for improvements. As the buyers departed to arrange for drovers to move the cattle, Colton approached, a proud smile lighting his features. "You drove a hard bargain," he observed. "Impressive." "I learned from watching Thomas," Faith said. "He always said never to take the first offer or even the second." "Well, your Thomas was a smart man," Colton replied, "and he married an even smarter woman." The compliment brought a flush to Faith's cheeks, but she was saved from responding by the approach of Eduardo, who wanted to discuss the distribution of wages now that the sale was complete. The next few days were busy as Faith settled accounts with her temporary hands and bid them farewell until the next roundup. By the end of the week, the ranch had returned to its normal rhythm, with only Faith, Eduardo, and Colton remaining. One evening, as Faith sat on the porch watching the sunset, Colton joined her, taking the chair beside hers with a respectful nod. "Beautiful evening," he observed, gazing out at the golden light spilling across the pastures. "It is," Faith agreed. She hesitated, then added, "I want to thank you for all your help these past weeks. The roundup wouldn't have gone nearly as smoothly without you." Colton turned to look at her, his expression serious. "It was my pleasure, Faith. Your ranch is special. You can feel it in the land, see it in the way you care for the place." Faith smiled, touched by his understanding. "It was Thomas's dream," she explained. "He bought this land when there was nothing on it but grass and a few scrub trees, built every building with his own hands. And now you're carrying on his legacy," Colton said. "That takes courage and determination." "Some days I'm not sure I have enough of either," Faith admitted, voicing a doubt she rarely shared. "The work never ends, and sometimes it feels like I'm just one bad season away from losing it all." Colton was silent for a moment, considering her words. "What if you didn't have to do it alone?" he asked finally. Faith glanced at him, uncertain of his meaning. "Eduardo has been a godsend, but he's not getting any younger." "I wasn't talking about Eduardo," Colton said quietly. Faith's heart began to beat faster as understanding dawned. "Colton, I'm not proposing anything improper," he hastened to assure her. "I just want you to know that I'm here for as long as you need me, not just as a hand but as someone you can rely on." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Faith found herself momentarily speechless. Since Thomas's death, she had shouldered the burden of the ranch alone, never allowing herself to lean on anyone else. The idea that she could share that burden, even a little, was both terrifying and deeply appealing. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do that for someone you barely know?" Colton's gaze was steady, his eyes reflecting the last golden rays of the setting sun. "Because in the short time I've known you, Faith O'Sullivan, I've come to admire you more than any person I've ever met. Your strength, your determination, your kindness. They're rare qualities, especially out here where life can make people hard and bitter." Faith looked away, overwhelmed by his words and the emotion behind them. "I'm still married in my heart," she said softly. "Thomas has been gone for 3 years, but sometimes it feels like he just rode out yesterday." "I understand," Colton said, and somehow Faith believed that he truly did. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, just the chance to stay and help, to be your friend if nothing else." Faith turned back to him, studying his face in the fading light. There was no guile there, no hidden agenda she could detect. Just honest emotion and a patience that spoke of a man who understood the value of waiting for something worthwhile. "Then I'd be grateful for your friendship," she said finally. "And your help." Colton's smile was like the breaking of dawn after a long night. "That's all I ask for now," he said, the words "for now" hanging in the air between them like a promise of possibilities to come. As summer faded into autumn, Colton became an indispensable part of life at the Double O. He worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk, taking on tasks that had been neglected for years due to Faith's limited resources. Under his care, fences were mended, buildings repaired, and equipment restored to working order. More than that, he brought a sense of security and companionship that Faith hadn't realized she was missing. Their evenings often ended on the porch, talking as the stars appeared overhead. Faith found herself sharing stories of her life with Thomas, memories both painful and precious that she had kept locked away since his death. Colton listened with genuine interest, offering comfort in his quiet, steady way when grief overtook her. In turn, Colton gradually revealed pieces of his own past. He had been born in Virginia, the son of a small-time horse breeder. When the Civil War came, his father had joined the Confederate Army and never returned, leaving Colton to care for his mother and younger sister. After his mother's death from consumption, Colton had seen his sister settled with a good husband before heading west to make his own way. "I've been wandering ever since," he confessed one evening as they sat by the fire. "Never staying in one place for too long, never putting down roots." "Why not?" Faith asked, genuinely curious. Colton had the skills and intelligence to establish himself anywhere he chose. Colton stared into the flames, his expression thoughtful. "I guess I was looking for something without knowing what it was," he said finally. "A place that felt like home, work that felt meaningful." "And have you found it?" Faith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Colton's eyes met hers across the fire. "I believe I have," he said simply. The air between them charged with unspoken emotions, a connection that grew stronger with each passing day. Yet true to his word, Colton never pressed for more than friendship, never made Faith feel that her loyalty to Thomas's memory was a barrier between them. As autumn deepened, bringing cooler temperatures and changing leaves, Faith found herself thinking of Colton's suggestion regarding the Hereford cattle. With the proceeds from the cattle sale secure in the bank, she could afford to invest in improving her herd. "I've been thinking about your idea," she told Colton one morning as they rode out to check on a section of fence. "About the Herefords in Amarillo." Colton nodded, his expression brightening. "It would be a smart investment." The cross-breeding would give you hardier calves, and they'd fetch a higher price at market. That's what I was thinking, Faith agreed. I'd like to ride over there and take a look, maybe purchase a bull if the stock is as good as you say. When would you like to go? Colton asked. Soon, before winter sets in and travel becomes difficult. Eduardo can manage the ranch for a few days. I'd be happy to accompany you, Colton offered. The road to Amarillo can be dangerous for a woman traveling alone. Faith smiled, grateful for his concern even as she chafed slightly at the implication that she couldn't handle herself. I've made the journey before, she reminded him, but I would welcome the company. They set out 3 days later, with Eduardo promising to keep an eye on things during their absence. The journey to Amarillo would take 2 days each way, with at least a day in between to examine the cattle and negotiate a purchase. As they rode side by side across the vast Texas landscape, Faith felt a sense of freedom she hadn't experienced in years. Since Thomas's death, her world had contracted to the boundaries of the Double O, her days consumed by the endless work of keeping the ranch afloat. This journey, brief as it was, felt like an adventure, a reminder that there was a world beyond her fences. Colton seemed to sense her mood, keeping the conversation light and entertaining as they rode. He had a gift for storytelling, painting vivid pictures with his words as he recounted tales of his travels across the West. Faith found herself laughing more than she had in years, the sound almost foreign to her own ears. They made camp that night beside a small creek. The horses hobbled nearby to graze on the sparse autumn grass. Colton built a fire while Faith prepared a simple supper of bacon, beans, and coffee. As they ate, the sky above them blazed with stars, more than Faith could ever hope to count. I used to do this with Thomas, she said, gazing upward. Camp under the stars, I mean. When we first bought the ranch, there was no house yet, just a tent and the land stretching out around us. Colton watched her from across the fire, his expression soft in the flickering light. You loved him very much. I did, Faith agreed, then corrected herself. I do. That kind of love doesn't just vanish even when the person is gone. No, Colton said quietly. It doesn't, it changes, but it doesn't disappear. Faith looked at him curiously. You speak as if from experience. Colton was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to the fire. There was a woman once, he finally said. Her name was Sarah. We were to be married. Faith waited, sensing there was more to the story. It was during the war, Colton continued. I was young, barely 18. Sarah lived on the neighboring farm. We'd known each other all our lives, but it wasn't until I was about to leave to find my father's regiment that we realized what we felt for each other. He paused, taking a sip of coffee before continuing. We promised to marry when I returned. I carried her letters with me everywhere, read them so many times I knew every word by heart. Faith's chest tightened with foreboding. What happened? Typhoid, Colton said simply. It swept through the county while I was gone. By the time I returned, Sarah had been in the ground for 3 months. Oh, Colton, Faith breathed, her heart aching for the young man he had been. I'm so sorry. Colton offered a small, sad smile. It was a long time ago, almost 15 years now. But you're right, that kind of love leaves its mark. Faith found herself moving around the fire to sit beside him, drawn by a shared understanding of loss that few could comprehend. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand in hers. Is that why you never settled down? She asked gently. Because of Sarah. Colton's fingers tightened around hers, his touch warm and reassuring. For a long time, yes, he admitted. I couldn't imagine feeling that way about anyone else. So I kept moving, kept working, never staying in one place long enough to form attachments. And now? Faith asked, barely daring to breathe. Colton turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the starlight above. "Now I'm beginning to think that sometimes life offers second chances," he said softly, "if we're brave enough to take them." The air between them seemed to still, the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a coyote the only sounds in the vast night. Faith was acutely aware of Colton's proximity, of the warmth of his hand in hers, of the way his eyes held a question he was too respectful to voice. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Colton raised his free hand to brush a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, and Faith found herself leaning into it, her eyes closing briefly at the contact. "Faith," he murmured, her name a question and a plea. Faith opened her eyes to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and a part of her, a part she had believed long dormant, wanted him to. But Colton, true to his word, did not press. Instead, he squeezed her hand once more before releasing it, the gesture somehow both a promise and a reassurance. "We should get some rest," he said, his voice slightly rough. "We have a long ride tomorrow." Faith nodded, unable to trust her voice. As she moved back to her bedroll, she felt a curious mixture of disappointment and relief. Disappointment that the moment had passed, and relief that Colton understood her need for time. As she lay beneath her blanket, listening to the night sounds and the occasional shifting of Colton on his bedroll across the fire, Faith thought about Thomas. Would he want her to mourn him forever? To deny herself the chance at happiness with another man? The answer came to her with surprising clarity. Thomas had loved life, had embraced it with both arms. He would not want her to spend the rest of her days alone, clinging to memories. He would want her to live, to love again if love came her way. With that realization came a sense of peace Faith hadn't felt in 3 long years. Thomas would always hold a place in her heart, but perhaps there was room for someone else as well. Someone patient and kind, who understood loss and respected her need to move forward at her own pace. As Faith drifted toward sleep, her last thought was of Colton's words. Sometimes life offers second chances if we're brave enough to take them. For the first time, she found herself wondering if she might be brave enough after all. They reached Amarillo the following afternoon, dusty and tired from the long ride. The town was larger than Whispering Creek, boasting a proper hotel, several saloons, a bank, and various shops along its main street. "We'll get rooms at the hotel," Colton said as they rode into town. "Rest up before visiting the ranch tomorrow." Faith nodded her agreement, though the idea of staying in a hotel, of being away from the ranch overnight, felt strange after so many years of routine. The last time she'd stayed in Amarillo had been with Thomas, nearly 4 years ago. The hotel clerk raised an eyebrow at the sight of Faith and Colton, clearly making assumptions about their relationship. Faith felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment, but Colton handled the situation with quiet dignity. "2 rooms, please," he said firmly. "One for the lady and one for myself." The clerk's expression shifted to one of apology as he handed over 2 keys. "Of course, sir. 2nd floor, rooms 4 and 5. After settling into their respective rooms and washing away the dust of the trail, Faith and Colton met for dinner in the hotel's small dining room. Faith had changed into her one good dress, a simple blue cotton that she kept for church and rare visits to town. She'd taken extra care with her appearance, pinning her hair up neatly and even applying a touch of rose water that she'd packed on impulse. Colton was waiting for her at a table by the window, and the way his eyes widened slightly at the sight of her sent a flutter through Faith's stomach. He rose as she approached, pulling out her chair with an old-world courtesy that spoke of his Virginia upbringing. "You look beautiful," he said simply as she took her seat. "Thank you," Faith replied, smoothing her skirt nervously. It's not often I have the occasion to wear a dress these days. It suits you, Colton assured her, though I must say you look equally at home in riding clothes. The meal was pleasant, the food far better than Faith had expected from a small-town hotel. They discussed their plans for the following day, with Colton explaining what to look for in the Hereford stock and strategies for negotiation. The rancher's name is Harrison, Colton told her. Joseph Harrison. I worked for him briefly about 2 years ago, helping with a cattle drive to Kansas. He's a fair man, won't try to cheat you, but he knows the value of his stock. I'll defer to your judgment on the quality of the animals, Faith said, but I'll handle the negotiation. Colton smiled approvingly. I wouldn't have it any other way. After dinner, they stepped outside to enjoy the cool evening air. The main street of Amarillo was busy with the usual evening traffic of cowboys, townspeople, and the occasional traveler passing through. Faith felt oddly conspicuous in her dress, aware of the glances she attracted as a woman walking alongside a man as handsome as Colton. Would you like to walk for a bit? Colton suggested. It might be nice to stretch our legs after the long ride. Faith nodded, grateful for his thoughtfulness. They strolled along the boardwalk, their conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. It struck Faith how comfortable she felt in Colton's company, how natural it was to share her thoughts and listen to his in return. As they passed a small general store, Faith paused, her attention caught by a display in the window. Among the various goods was a book, its leather cover embossed with gold lettering. Practical cattle breeding for the modern rancher. That looks interesting, Faith remarked, studying the book through the glass. Wait here, Colton said, before disappearing into the store. He emerged moments later with a wrapped package which he presented to Faith with a smile. Consider it an investment in the future of the 00. Faith took the package, touched by the gesture. Colton, you didn't have to, I wanted to, he interrupted gently. Besides, if we're going to improve your herd, we should be well informed. The word "we" didn't escape Faith's notice. It implied a partnership, a shared future that until recently she wouldn't have allowed herself to contemplate. Thank you, she said sincerely. For the book and for everything. Colton's smile deepened, his eyes warm as they met hers. You're welcome, Faith. As they continued their walk back to the hotel, Faith was acutely aware of Colton's presence beside her, of the occasional brush of his arm against hers as they navigated the crowded boardwalk. It had been so long since she'd felt this way, nervous yet excited, aware of every glance and touch, anticipating what might come next. At the door to her hotel room, Faith paused, the wrapped book clutched to her chest like a shield. Well, good night, she said, suddenly shy. What time should we leave in the morning? 8 o'clock should give us plenty of time to reach Harrison's ranch, Colton replied. He hesitated, then took a step closer. Faith, I want you to know that today, riding with you, talking with you, it's been one of the best days I've had in a very long time. Faith's heart quickened at his words and his proximity. For me as well, she admitted softly. Colton reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed his fingers along her cheek. The touch was feather light, yet sent warmth spreading through her entire body. Sleep well, he murmured before stepping back, his self-control evident in the tension of his shoulders and the careful way he held himself. Good night, Colton, Faith replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Inside her room, Faith leaned against the closed door, her pulse racing and her cheek still tingling from Colton's touch. She was treading dangerous ground, she knew. Opening her heart again meant risking the pain of loss, a pain she had sworn never to endure a second time. Yet there was something about Colton Vance that made the risk seem worthwhile. Perhaps it was the fact that he, too, had known deep loss and understood its lasting effects. Or perhaps it was simply the way he looked at her, not with pity for the widow struggling to maintain her husband's ranch, but with admiration for the woman she was. Faith placed the wrapped book on the bedside table and began to prepare for bed, her mind still filled with thoughts of Colton and the possibilities that stretched before them. Harrison's ranch lay about 10 miles outside of Amarillo, a sprawling operation that dwarfed the Double O in both size and prosperity. As Faith and Colton rode up to the main house the next morning, Faith couldn't help but feel a twinge of intimidation at the evident success of the place. Joseph Harrison proved to be a burly man in his 50s, with a booming voice and a handshake that threatened to crush Faith's fingers. His initial surprise at finding a woman rancher quickly gave way to respect when Colton explained Faith's situation and intentions. "Any woman who can keep a ranch running on her own has my admiration," Harrison declared. "Now, let's go look at those Herefords you're interested in." The morning was spent examining Harrison's prize stock, with Colton pointing out the traits that made the Herefords valuable for crossbreeding. Faith listened and learned, asking questions that impressed both men with her quick understanding and practical approach. By midday, Faith had decided on a young bull and 2 heifers, confident that they would make an excellent foundation for improving her herd. The negotiation with Harrison was straightforward, with the older rancher offering a fair price that Faith accepted after only minimal haggling. "I'll have my men deliver them to your ranch next week," Harrison promised as they concluded their business. "And if you ever need advice about handling them, you're welcome to send word." "Thank you," Faith said, genuinely grateful for his respectful treatment. "I appreciate your willingness to sell to a small operation like mine." Harrison clapped a hand on her shoulder, nearly staggering her with the force. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I started with just 10 head of cattle and a broken-down cabin. If you've got the determination to make it work, which I reckon you do, your ranch won't stay small for long." They left Harrison's ranch in high spirits, Faith excited about the potential the new stock represented for the Double O's future. The return journey to Amarillo seemed shorter somehow, filled as it was with animated discussion about breeding plans and how to integrate the Herefords into the existing herd. They reached the hotel by late afternoon, with plans to begin the journey back to Whispering Creek early the next morning. After cleaning up from their ride, Faith and Colton once again met for dinner in the hotel dining room. "To the future of the Double O," Colton proposed, raising his glass in a toast. "To the future," Faith agreed, touching her glass to his. She hesitated, then added softly, "and to new beginnings." Colton's eyes brightened at her words, a smile spreading across his features. "New beginnings," he echoed, holding her gaze. The meal passed in pleasant conversation, but Faith was increasingly aware of an undercurrent of tension between them, a mutual awareness that their relationship was poised on the brink of change. After dinner, as they stood in the hotel corridor outside their rooms, that tension crystallized into a moment of decision. Colton turned to Faith, his expression serious yet gentle. "Faith," he began, his voice low, "I've respected the boundaries you've set, and I'll continue to do so for as long as you need. But I want to be honest with you about how I feel." Faith's heart began to race, but she nodded for him to continue. "I care for you," Colton said simply. "More than I thought possible after Sarah. When I'm with you, I feel as though I've finally found what I've been looking for all these years." Faith stood very still, overwhelmed by his words and by her own conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to retreat into the safety of her grief, where expectations were clear and her heart was protected. Another part, a part that grew stronger each day, yearned to embrace the chance at happiness that Colton offered. I don't expect an answer tonight, Colton continued, his eyes never leaving hers. I just wanted you to know. Whatever you decide, whatever you need, I'm here. In that moment, standing in the dimly lit hotel corridor with Colton's heart laid bare before her, Faith made her decision. She had mourned Thomas for 3 long years, had honored his memory in every possible way. But Thomas was gone, and she was still here, still alive, still capable of love. Slowly, giving herself time to change her mind if doubt overtook her, Faith stepped forward and placed her hands on Colton's chest. She felt his sharp intake of breath, saw the hope and uncertainty warring in his eyes. "Colton," she whispered, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I care for you too. I think I have almost from the beginning, though I wasn't ready to admit it, even to myself." Colton's hands came up to cover hers, warm and strong. "Faith," he murmured, her name a prayer on his lips. "I'm still learning how to live without Thomas," Faith continued, needing him to understand. "There are days when the grief is still overwhelming. I can't promise it will be easy being with me." "I don't want easy," Colton assured her, one hand moving to cup her cheek. "I want you, with all your memories and grief and strength. I want to build something with you, something that honors the past while looking toward the future." Faith's eyes filled with tears at his words, at the understanding and acceptance they contained. "Then I'd like to try," she said softly, "to see what we might build together." Colton's smile was radiant, lighting his entire face. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down until his lips were a breath away from hers. "May I?" he whispered, his eyes seeking permission. In answer, Faith closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with promise. Colton's arms came around her, holding her as if she were something infinitely precious, his kiss conveying without words all that he felt for her. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Faith knew with certainty that she had made the right choice. The love she had felt for Thomas would always be a part of her, but it did not prevent her from opening her heart to Colton. Instead, it had prepared her to recognize true love when it came again. "I should say good night," Colton said reluctantly, his arms still around her waist. Faith nodded, though she made no move to step away. "We have an early start tomorrow." Colton pressed one more gentle kiss to her forehead before releasing her. "Sleep well, Faith," he said, his voice warm with emotion. "I'll see you in the morning." As Faith entered her room and closed the door behind her, she felt lighter than she had in years, as if some invisible burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The grief was still there, a quiet ache in her heart, but now it was accompanied by something new: hope and the possibility of joy. The journey back to Whispering Creek seemed to pass in a blur, the miles falling away beneath their horses' hooves as Faith and Colton rode side by side. There was a new ease between them, a shared understanding that needed no words. Occasionally their hands would brush as they rode, or their eyes would meet in silent communication, each contact a small affirmation of the connection they had acknowledged. They made camp that night in the same spot as before, but everything felt different. As they sat by the fire after supper, Colton moved to sit beside Faith rather than across from her. When he tentatively put his arm around her shoulders, she leaned into him without hesitation, savoring the warmth and solidity of his presence. "What are you thinking?" Colton asked softly, his breath stirring her hair. Faith considered the question, wanting to answer honestly. "I'm thinking that I never expected to feel this way again," she admitted. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of me had died with him." Colton's arm tightened around her, a gesture of understanding. "I felt the same way after Sarah," he said, "as if the capacity for that kind of love had been burned out of me." "What changed?" Faith asked, tilting her head to look up at him. Colton smiled, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You," he said simply. "Meeting you, getting to know you, seeing your strength and your heart, it woke up something in me I thought was gone forever." Faith felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spreading through her chest. She reached up to touch Colton's face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I'm glad you found your way to the 00," she murmured. "So am I," Colton replied, before lowering his head to kiss her with a tenderness that made her heart ache in the sweetest way. They returned to the ranch the following afternoon to find everything in order, Eduardo greeting them with a knowing look that suggested he had anticipated the change in their relationship. "The hands for the Harrison delivery will be here next week," Faith informed him as they unsaddled their horses. "They're bringing a bull and 2 heifers." Eduardo nodded approvingly. "Herefords?" he asked, glancing at Colton. "Yes," Faith confirmed. "It was Colton's suggestion, and after seeing Harrison's herd, I think it's a good one." "Buena idea," Eduardo agreed. "We'll make strong calves." As they settled back into the rhythm of ranch life, Faith found herself adjusting to this new reality where Colton was no longer just a hired hand, but something more. They were still finding their way, navigating the transition from friendship to deeper affection with careful consideration for Faith's lingering grief and the proprieties of their situation. Colton continued to sleep in the bunkhouse, maintaining a respectful distance that Faith appreciated even as she found herself increasingly drawn to him. Their days were filled with work side by side, their evenings with conversation that deepened their understanding of each other. News traveled fast in small towns, and it wasn't long before Whispering Creek began to take notice of the changing relationship between the widow O'Sullivan and her handsome cowboy. Some, like Mr. Garrison at the general store, observed the development with approval, having worried about Faith's solitude since Thomas's death. Others were less supportive, particularly Mrs. Pembroke, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of the town's moral standards. Faith became aware of whispers and sidelong glances when she visited town, of conversations that abruptly ceased when she entered the general store. "Pay them no mind," Colton advised when Faith mentioned the gossip. "People will always talk. It's the way of small towns." "I know," Faith sighed. "It's just, I don't want them thinking I've forgotten Thomas or that I'm being disrespectful to his memory." Colton took her hands in his expression serious. "Faith, no one who truly knew Thomas could ever think that. And those who would judge you for finding happiness again aren't worth your concern." Faith squeezed his hands gratefully, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "You're right," she acknowledged. "It's just difficult being under such scrutiny." "Would you rather I left?" Colton asked quietly. "Found work elsewhere until enough time has passed that people wouldn't talk." The question caught Faith off guard. The thought of Colton leaving, of returning to the solitude that had been her life for 3 years, was suddenly unbearable. "No," she said firmly. "I don't want you to leave. What we're building together is too important to sacrifice because of idle gossip." Colton's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I was hoping you'd say that," he admitted. "Because the thought of leaving you, even temporarily, is more than I could bear." The arrival of Harrison's men with the Hereford cattle provided a welcome distraction from the town's gossip. The bull, a magnificent animal with a broad white face and reddish-brown body, was even more impressive than Faith remembered. The 2 heifers were equally fine specimens, their bloodlines promising excellent offspring when bred with the 00's existing stock. "They're beautiful," Faith said as she and Colton watched the animals being unloaded into a separate pasture. "Worth every penny. They'll transform your herd within a few years," Colton predicted. By the time the first crossbred calves are ready for market, you'll see the difference in both quality and price. Faith glanced at him, struck by his use of you rather than we. Despite their growing closeness, Colton was still careful not to presume too much about his place in her future. "Our herd," she corrected gently, "if you're planning to stay." Colton's eyes widened slightly, then softened with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere," he assured her. "As long as you want me here, this is where I'll be." The weeks passed, autumn deepening toward winter. The days grew shorter and the nights colder, bringing Faith and Colton closer as they shared the increased workload of preparing the ranch for the coming season. Together, they repaired the barn roof, stockpiled firewood, and ensured the livestock had adequate shelter and feed to see them through the winter months. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire in Faith's parlor, reading from the book Colton had given her or simply talking, their conversations ranging from practical ranch matters to dreams for the future. Occasionally, Eduardo would join them, his quiet presence a reminder of the continuity between Faith's past with Thomas and her evolving present with Colton. One evening in late November, as the first real cold snap of the season settled over the land, Faith found herself watching Colton as he explained a passage from the cattle breeding book. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the strength of his jaw, the intelligence in his eyes, the gentle curve of his lips as he spoke. In that moment, the last lingering doubt in Faith's heart dissolved like morning mist before the sun. She loved this man not with the passionate first love she had felt for Thomas, but with a deeper, more knowing love born of shared experiences and mutual respect. It was no less powerful for being different, no less true for coming second. "Colton," she interrupted softly, causing him to look up from the book with raised eyebrows. "Yes," he asked, setting the book aside. Faith took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I love you," she said simply, the words falling into the quiet room like stones into still water. Colton went very still, his eyes widening as he processed her declaration. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, transforming his features with a joy so pure it took Faith's breath away. "I love you too, Faith," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I've loved you since that first day at the cemetery, when you stood so strong and proud at your husband's grave." Faith moved from her chair to sit beside him on the sofa, her hand finding his. "I never thought I would love again," she confessed. "Never thought I would want to." "I know," Colton said, raising her hand to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "That's why it means so much, hearing you say those words." Faith leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Where do we go from here?" she asked softly. Colton's arm came around her, holding her close. "Wherever you want," he assured her. "I'm in no hurry, Faith. We have time." But Faith, having finally acknowledged the truth of her feelings, found herself unwilling to wait any longer. Life on the frontier had taught her the value of seizing happiness when it presented itself, knowing how quickly it could be snatched away. "Marry me," she said, lifting her head to meet his surprised gaze. "Not tomorrow or next week, but soon. Before spring, perhaps." Colton cupped her face in his hands, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel rushed or to think that I expect." Faith silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her certainty into the gesture. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, she said firmly, "I'm sure, Colton. I've had 3 years to mourn Thomas. I don't want to waste any more time living half a life." Colton smiled, his thumbs gently caressing her cheeks. "Then yes, Faith O'Sullivan, I will marry you, whenever and however you wish." The news of Faith and Colton's engagement spread through Whispering Creek with the speed of a prairie fire. Reactions were mixed, as Faith had expected. Her friends and those who had known Thomas well offered congratulations, expressing genuine pleasure at her found happiness. Others, particularly those who had never approved of a woman running her own ranch, were less supportive, muttering about propriety and respect for the dead. Faith found she cared less about the opinions of others than she might have expected. With Colton by her side, secure in the knowledge that her love for him in no way diminished what she had felt for Thomas, she could face the town's judgment with her head held high. They decided on a February wedding, a quiet ceremony at the small church in Whispering Creek, followed by a celebration at the ranch. It would be simple but meaningful, a true beginning rather than an elaborate spectacle. As winter settled over the land, bringing with it both the beauty and challenges of the season, Faith and Colton grew closer still. Colton moved from the bunkhouse to a small room off the kitchen, maintaining a respectable distance while still being part of the household. Together they weathered winter storms, nursed sick cattle, and planned for the spring calving season that would bring the first Hereford crossbreeds to the Double O. Christmas came, bringing with it a softening of the winter's harshness and a spirit of celebration that even the most remote ranches embraced. Faith decorated the house with evergreen boughs and candles, baked cookies from her mother's recipes, and even convinced Eduardo and Colton to help her find and cut a small pine tree to stand in the parlor. On Christmas Eve, after a festive dinner shared with Eduardo and his sister's family who had ridden over from their small farm nearby, Faith found herself alone with Colton in the parlor. The candles on the tree cast a warm glow throughout the room, and a fire crackled merrily in the hearth, keeping the winter chill at bay. "I have something for you," Colton said, reaching into his pocket. "It's not much, but—" He withdrew a small wooden box clearly handmade, its surface polished to a soft sheen. Faith took it carefully, admiring the craftsmanship. "Did you make this?" she asked, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Colton nodded, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "I've been working on it in the evenings, in the barn when you thought I was checking on the horses." Faith opened the box to find a simple gold band inside, understated yet beautifully crafted. "Colton," she breathed, lifting the ring to examine it more closely. "It was my mother's," Colton explained. "The only thing of value she left behind when she passed. She told me to give it to the woman I would spend my life with." Faith's eyes filled with tears at the significance of the gift. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I would be honored to wear it." Colton took the ring from her fingers and slid it onto her left hand, where it settled comfortably alongside the wedding band from Thomas that Faith had continued to wear. "I don't expect you to remove his ring," Colton said, noticing her glance at the two bands now adorning her finger. "Thomas will always be a part of you, a part of this ranch. I would never ask you to pretend otherwise." Faith's heart swelled with love for this man who understood her so completely, who accepted her past as an integral part of who she was. "Thank you," she said simply, the words inadequate to express the depth of her gratitude. She reached beneath the tree for a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "I have something for you as well," she said, handing it to Colton. "It's not a family heirloom, but I hope you'll like it." Colton unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with his initials. "It's beautiful," he said, running his fingers over the supple leather. "Open it," Faith urged. Inside, on the first page, Faith had written an inscription. "For Colton, to record our journey together. All my love, Faith." Colton looked up, his eyes bright with emotion. "It's perfect," he said softly. "Thank you." "I thought you might use it to write down your ideas for the ranch," Faith explained. "You have so many good ones, and this way we can keep track of them all." Colton smiled, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I will," he promised, "though I might also use it to write down other things." "Such as?" Faith asked curiously. Colton's smile deepened, his eyes warm as they held hers. "Such as how beautiful you look in candlelight, or how your laugh makes me feel like I've come home after a long journey. The way you furrow your brow when you're concentrating, or how your hands are both strong and gentle when you're tending to a sick animal." Faith felt a blush rising to her cheeks at his words. "I had no idea you were so poetic, Mr. Vance," she teased gently. "Neither did I," Colton admitted with a chuckle. "You seem to bring it out in me." He leaned forward to kiss her, a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened, conveying all the love and desire that had been building between them. Faith responded in kind, her arms winding around his neck to draw him closer. When they finally parted, both breathless, Colton rested his forehead against hers. "February seems very far away," he murmured. Faith laughed softly, understanding his meaning all too well. She shared his impatience, the desire to begin their life together in every sense. "It will be here before we know it," she assured him, though the words were as much for herself as for him. January brought heavy snow and bitter cold, keeping Faith and Colton close to the ranch as they focused on maintaining the health of the livestock and conserving their supplies until spring. The forced confinement might have strained a less compatible couple, but they found a rhythm together, each respecting the other's need for occasional solitude while still sharing the bulk of their days. As February approached, preparations for the wedding began in earnest. Faith rode into town to order fabric for a new dress, choosing a rich blue that complemented her eyes rather than the traditional white. Colton, with Eduardo's help, built a new headboard for the bed that would soon be theirs, carving intricate patterns of leaves and flowers into the wood. 3 days before the wedding, a fierce blizzard swept across the plains, forcing Faith and Colton to spend hours in the biting cold, ensuring that the cattle had access to food and water. They worked side by side, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, communicating through gestures more than words as the howling wind made conversation nearly impossible. By the time they returned to the house, both were exhausted and chilled to the bone. Faith built up the fire in the kitchen stove while Colton fetched water for washing, their movements choreographed by months of working together. "Your hands are like ice," Faith observed, taking Colton's between her own and rubbing them vigorously. "Sit down and warm yourself while I make some coffee." Colton obeyed, sinking gratefully into a chair at the kitchen table. As Faith bustled around preparing coffee and heating leftover stew for their supper, he watched her with a contentment that went bone deep. "Do you know what I was thinking out there today, in the middle of that blizzard?" he asked. Faith glanced over her shoulder, an eyebrow raised questioningly. "That you should have kept riding when you reached the 00 and found yourself a ranch in California instead." Colton laughed, shaking his head. "Quite the opposite, actually. I was thinking how lucky I am to have found you, to have found this place. How there's nowhere else on earth I'd rather be, even in the middle of a blizzard." Faith's expression softened, her eyes warm with affection. "Even when your fingers are freezing and your feet are soaked through?" "Even then," Colton confirmed, "because you're here, and that makes everything else worthwhile." Faith abandoned the coffee to cross the kitchen and press a kiss to Colton's forehead. "I feel the same way," she assured him, "though I reserve the right to complain about the cold occasionally." "Duly noted," Colton agreed with a smile, catching her hand and pulling her down for a proper kiss. The day of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the recent snow blanketing the landscape in pristine white. Faith woke early, watching the sunrise from her bedroom window, her thoughts a mixture of anticipation and reflection. Today she would marry again, would stand before God and community to pledge her life to a man who wasn't Thomas. Yet as she fingered the ring Colton had given her at Christmas, Faith felt only peace about her decision. Thomas would always hold a place in her heart, but Colton had created a space all his own, equally important but distinctly different. Eduardo's sister Maria arrived mid-morning to help Faith dress for the ceremony. The blue dress, simply cut but elegantly tailored, complemented Faith's auburn hair and brought out the color of her eyes. Maria arranged Faith's hair in a simple updo, weaving a ribbon through the braided crown and letting a few tendrils frame her face. "You look beautiful, Senora," Maria declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Senor Colton will not be able to take his eyes off you." Faith smiled, touched by the other woman's enthusiasm. "Thank you, Maria, for everything." Meanwhile, Colton was preparing at the bunkhouse, with Eduardo serving as his unofficial groomsman. He had purchased a new shirt and black string tie for the occasion, and had even submitted to a proper haircut during their last visit to town. "Nervous?" Eduardo asked as Colton straightened his tie for the third time. Colton considered the question, then shook his head. "No," he said honestly. "Not about marrying Faith. That's the surest decision I've ever made." Eduardo nodded approvingly. "You are good for her," he said, his usual economy with words making the compliment all the more meaningful. "She smiles again since you came." Colton felt a warmth spreading through his chest at the older man's words. Eduardo had been Thomas's friend before becoming Faith's loyal foreman. His blessing meant more than Colton could express. "Thank you," he said simply, offering his hand to the Mexican. Eduardo took it, then surprised Colton by pulling him into a brief, fierce hug. "You take care of her," he said gruffly. "She is special, that one." "I know," Colton assured him. "I will. Always." The ceremony at the small church in Whispering Creek was simple but meaningful. Faith walked down the aisle alone, her head held high as she met Colton's gaze. He waited for her at the altar, his eyes never leaving hers, his expression a mixture of wonder and profound love that made Faith's heart swell in her chest. The Reverend's words were traditional but personal, acknowledging Faith's previous marriage while celebrating the new beginning she and Colton were embarking upon together. When it came time for the vows, Faith spoke clearly, her voice steady as she promised to love, honor, and cherish Colton for all the days of her life. Colton's voice, in contrast, was rough with emotion as he repeated the vows, his hands holding Faith's as if they were the most precious things on earth. When he slid his mother's ring onto Faith's finger to join her engagement band, his fingers brushed against Thomas's wedding ring, still in its place. The moment might have been awkward, but Colton simply smiled, his eyes conveying his understanding and acceptance. The celebration afterward at the Double O was a joyous affair, with neighbors and friends from miles around gathering to wish the couple well. Even Mrs. Pembroke, who had been among the most vocal critics of the match, seemed won over by the obvious happiness radiating from the bride and groom. As the evening wore on, with music and dancing and plenty of good food, Faith found a moment to slip away to the porch for a breath of fresh air. She stood looking out over the ranch, her ranch, now hers and Colton's together, marveling at how life could change in ways one never anticipated. 3 years ago, standing at Thomas's grave, if someone had told her she would find love again, would marry a man as good and true as Colton Vance, she would have called them a liar. Yet here she was, a bride once more, her heart full to bursting with love and hope for the future. She heard the door open behind her and knew without turning that it was Colton. His arms came around her waist, drawing her back against his chest as he pressed a kiss to her temple. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "You disappeared." Faith leaned into him, savoring his warmth and strength. "I'm more than all right," she assured him. "I just needed a moment to take it all in, to appreciate how fortunate I am." Colton turned her in his arms, his eyes searching hers in the dim light spilling from the windows. "I'm the fortunate one," he countered. "To have found you, to have you agree to share your life with me." Faith smiled, reaching up to touch his face. "Then we're both fortunate," she conceded. "And I intend to remind myself of that fact every day for the rest of our lives." Colton lowered his head to kiss her, a kiss that held all the promise of the years stretching before them. When they parted, he asked, "Shall we go back inside? I believe they'll be expecting us for the first dance." Faith nodded, but before they turned to go, she glanced once more at the moonlit landscape of the Double O. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when I first met you, they called me a widow for so long. And you, I said I'd wait longer," Colton finished for her, smiling at the memory. "However long it took for you to be ready." Faith squeezed his hand, grateful beyond words for his patience and understanding. "Thank you for waiting," she said softly, "for giving me the time I needed." "I would have waited forever," Colton assured her, his voice holding nothing but truth. "But I'm very glad I didn't have to." With that, they returned to their wedding celebration, to the music and laughter and good wishes of friends and neighbors. And as they danced together for the first time as husband and wife, Faith felt Thomas's memory settle peacefully within her heart, a beloved part of her past that would always be honored but no longer defined her future. That future, bright with promise and possibility, now belonged to Faith and Colton, together a second chance at love neither had expected, but both embraced with grateful hearts. The years that followed brought both joy and challenges to Faith and Colton, as life on the frontier always did. Their first year of marriage saw the birth of the crossbred, calves they had planned for, sturdy animals with the Hereford's distinctive white face, and the resilience of the Double O's original stock. When they drove the first batch to market, the price they commanded exceeded even Colton's optimistic predictions. With the profits, they were able to expand the ranch operations, purchasing adjoining land that had gone fallow after its owner passed away without heirs. The Double O grew from 2,000 acres to nearly 5,000, requiring additional hands and creating a reputation throughout the territory for quality stock and fair dealing. Faith and Colton worked side by side through it all, their partnership in life extending seamlessly to their partnership in business. Faith's practical wisdom combined with Colton's innovative ideas created an operation that prospered even when drought or harsh winters caused other ranches to struggle. In their second year of marriage, Faith discovered she was expecting a child. The news filled her with a mixture of joy and trepidation. At 32, she was older than most first-time mothers in their community, and childbirth on the frontier was always fraught with risk. Colton, however, was unequivocally delighted. He took on extra work to allow Faith to rest more as her pregnancy progressed, and spent evenings crafting a beautiful cradle from the same wood he had used for their bed's headboard. "What do you hope for?" Faith asked one night as they lay in bed, Colton's hand resting gently on her growing belly. "A boy or a girl?" Colton considered the question seriously. "Either would be a blessing," he said finally. "A daughter with your spirit and determination would be a wonder to behold, and a son." He paused, then added softly, "A son we could name Thomas if you'd like." Faith turned to look at him, her eyes filling with tears at the generosity of the suggestion. "You would do that?" she asked, touched beyond words. Colton nodded, his expression tender. "He was an important part of your life, Faith. He helped make you the woman I love. Honoring his memory in our child would be a privilege, not a sacrifice." Faith reached up to touch his face, her heart so full of love it seemed impossible to contain. Thomas Colton Vance, she mused, trying the name. It has a fine sound. It does, Colton agreed with a smile. Though if it's a girl, I think we should name her after you. Faith is a beautiful name for a daughter. In the end, they were blessed with a son, born on a crisp autumn day with Eduardo's sister Maria serving as midwife. Thomas Colton Vance came into the world with a lusty cry, and a shock of dark hair that promised to be the same rich mahogany as his father's. Colton, who had paced anxiously outside the bedroom during the hours of Faith's labor, was overwhelmed with emotion when Maria finally called him in to meet his son. Faith, exhausted but radiant, watched with joy as Colton carefully took the tiny bundle in his arms, his expression a mixture of awe and fierce protectiveness. "He's perfect," Colton whispered, gazing down at the infant's small face. "Faith, he's absolutely perfect." "He is," Faith agreed, her heart expanding with love for both her husband and their son. "Welcome to the world, Thomas Colton Vance." As little Thomas grew, it became clear that he had inherited the best traits of both his parents. Faith's determination and practicality alongside Colton's curiosity and gentle strength. By the time he was toddling around the ranch, a second child was on the way, a daughter they named Sarah Faith, honoring both Colton's first love and Faith herself. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and years, each bringing its own joys and sorrows, triumphs and setbacks. The Double O continued to prosper under Faith and Colton's stewardship, becoming one of the most respected ranches in the territory. Their children thrived in the freedom of ranch life, learning the value of hard work, the importance of integrity, and the rewards of perseverance. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Faith and Colton returned to Amarillo, leaving the children in the capable care of Eduardo and Maria for a brief respite from the demands of ranch and family. They stayed at the same hotel where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other, walking the same streets and reminiscing about that pivotal journey. "You ever regret it?" Faith asked as they sat in the hotel dining room, a table away from where they had dined a decade before. Stopping at the Double O that day, taking a job with a widow struggling to keep her ranch afloat, Colton reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb brushing over the 2 gold bands she still wore side by side. "Not for a single moment," he assured her. "Finding you, building a life with you, has been the greatest blessing of my existence." Faith smiled, the years having added character to her beauty rather than diminishing it. "Even with all the hardships, the droughts and blizzards, the cattle fever 2 years ago, my terrible cooking." Colton laughed, shaking his head. "Your cooking has improved dramatically," he teased. "And as for the rest, those are just the costs of the life we've chosen. The rewards far outweigh them." Faith squeezed his hand, knowing he spoke the truth. Their life together hadn't been easy, but it had been rich and full, marked by a deep love that had only grown stronger through shared challenges and triumphs. "You remember what you said to me that first day at Thomas's grave?" Faith asked, her mind traveling back to their beginning. Colton's brow furrowed slightly as he searched his memory. "I'm not sure I said anything particularly memorable. I was too busy trying not to stare at the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen." Faith blushed, still susceptible to his compliments even after a decade of marriage. "Not in those exact words, perhaps, but when Mrs. Pembroke warned you off, saying I was still a widow in my heart and likely to remain so for years to come, you told her that I'd wait longer," Colton finished, the memory returning. "That some people were worth waiting for, no matter how long it took." Faith nodded, her eyes soft with emotion. "You did wait, patiently, respectfully, giving me all the time I needed to be ready. And I would do it again," Colton assured her, lifting her hand to press a kiss to her knuckles. 1,000 times over if necessary. Thank you, Faith said simply. For your patience then, and for the life we've built since. I can't imagine walking this path with anyone but you. Colton's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled, the lines testament to a decade of laughter and sun. Nor I with anyone but you, Faith Vance. You are the heart of my heart, the very center of my world. As they walked back to their hotel room hand in hand, Faith reflected on the strange, beautiful journey that had brought her to this point. The grief that had once threatened to consume her had transformed over time into a quiet remembrance, a part of her story but no longer its defining chapter. Thomas would always hold a place in her heart, just as Sarah held a place in Colton's. But life had granted them both a second chance at love, a love no less profound for coming later, for being built on the foundation of past joys and sorrows. In their shared room, with moonlight spilling through the window just as it had that night 10 years ago, Faith turned to Colton with a smile that held all the wisdom and love of their years together. They called me a widow for too long, she murmured, echoing the words that had once defined her in the eyes of Whispering Creek. Colton drew her into his arms, his voice soft as he completed the thought. And I said I'd wait longer, but I'm very glad I didn't have to wait forever. So am I, Faith whispered, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his in a kiss that held both the sweet familiarity of a decade shared and the enduring passion of a love that continued to deepen with each passing year. Outside their window, the stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of time as they had for millennia. But within that room, time seemed to stand still, holding Faith and Colton in a perfect moment of connection, two souls who had found in each other not just comfort or companionship, but the rare and precious gift of a love strong enough to honor the past while embracing the future with open hearts and steadfast faith.